Okay. And I think most people are here. So, Gail, do you want to do the intro? Because you were, you know, Anastasia's background pretty well. Is that okay? Or do you want to, Richard, do you want to start right off with the meeting with Anastasia?
Is
or do you
Anastasia
wanna-
here? Is
Yes.
Anastasia
Thank
here?
you.
Yeah, I'll just introduce really quickly Anastasia Rudenko, who is one of the lead engineers on the Oak Bluffs Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan, and she's here to present, you know, a draft and probably where we are. And I think instructive, you know, in addition to the plan, instructive for this group, for those up island that don't have SOAR, it is a wastewater management plan, and it may be instructive to show what a comparable 208 plan may look like that, you know, we need to satisfy for the up island towns to DEP, you know, for, you know, getting into the water trust. That's all. And I'll give it to Anastasia.
Great. Thank you very much, Gail. Let me just, would you mind making me a host or allowing me to share my screen so that I could pull up the presentation? Oh, perfect. It works for me now.
That's so funny. That's crazy.
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction, Gail. So my name is Anastasia Rudenko, and I'm working with Mark Drainville. We're both from GHD, which is an environmental engineering firm on the Town of Oak Bluffs Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan. And we wanted to give an update on the progress of the plan today, starting out with the discussion of the problem, the plan, the environmental needs that the plan is designed to address, start the conversation about financial planning to implement the plan, and future nitrogen management, and then wrap up with next steps in the implementation of the plan itself. So the reason that the town needs a comprehensive wastewater plan is that the majority of the properties in Oak Bluffs are on septic systems, and it's on septic systems that are not designed to break down nitrogen. So as population has grown in the town, there's an excessive amount of nitrogen being contributed to the coastal ponds. And the Massachusetts Estuaries Project, which has been completed for all 5 ponds in the town of Oak Bluffs, has shown that this is causing degradation to the ponds, and that the majority of the excess nitrogen that's coming in is from septic systems. As part of our analysis, we looked for the watersheds in Oak Bluffs, what percentage of septic nitrogen needs to be removed in each of the watersheds in order to meet the target nitrogen goals that are set by the Massachusetts Estuaries Project to restore those ponds. Those original reports were done in about are using data from about 2009. So as part of this project, we've updated those numbers looking at the amount of growth in each watershed, and then also adjusting for major sewering. So one big example is the Vineyard Haven corridor, where the YMCA and the school have been sewered since those MEP reports were done. So adjustments were made both ways to come up with an estimated number for today, about 2020. And as you can see, one of the largest nitrogen removals that's needed is in Lagoon Pond. So this chart shows everything in the dark blue lines are properties that contribute to a certain watershed. So everything within this line drains to Lagoon Pond. Everything within this line drains to Senjikataket Pond, and so forth. And then this plan needs to look not just for today, but into the future. So as part of our project, we looked at a 20-year projection looked at available population projection and available data for how the town would redevelop, and came up with estimates through 2040 of how much nitrogen would need to be removed to meet not only current but future conditions for the town. And the next slide just shows the numbers side by side, 2020 and 2040. And as you can see, for the majority of the watersheds, as anticipated, as growth continues in the watersheds, the amount of septic nitrogen that needs to be managed goes up. The town of Oak Bluffs has a centralized wastewater treatment facility, which is made up of these two brown buildings and this structure here. So this is the property. It's a infrastructure that was put in about 20 years ago, and the majority of the equipment is designed to last about 20 years. So it's not at, but it is starting to approach the end of its design life for some of the major equipment. These are pumps and blowers that run 24 hours a day. And it's also starting to reach its design capacity. So there's very limited capacity for new connections. So as part of this project, we're looking at how can this infrastructure be optimized to extend its life, and then also to add the capacity that's needed to be able to treat additional flow at the facility. So our overall goal with this project is to come up with a plan that'll restore the coastal pond's natural habitats, which includes its native shellfish species, native eelgrass species, and marine species, through the development of a wastewater and nitrogen management plan over a 20-year planning period. And in order to be successful, that plan needs to integrate environmental needs of the town. It needs to integrate a financial planning component, existing needs for the existing wastewater treatment facility and collection system, and it needs to think about how nitrogen will be managed in the future. So not just for today's conditions, but as the town continues to develop into the future. So as ponds exceed the amount of nitrogen that they can assimilate in their water bodies, there are multiple environmental factors, including environmental growth. So this is a photo of algae growth in lagoon ponds, shellfish impacts. And then as this algae blooms and dies, it uses up the oxygen in the bottom of the ponds, which leads to the potential for fish kills. And nitrogen also contributes to public health concerns, including endococcus-related beach closures. So these are all environmental needs that we're trying to manage with this project. In order to develop the most cost-effective approach for the town, we're looking to balance two major different types of technologies. The first are what are known as non-sewering technologies. And these are being incorporated to reduce the overall cost of the program where feasible. So these include innovative and alternative systems, which are on-site septic systems that are specifically designed to break down effluent nitrogen, permeable reactive barriers, which is an in-ground system that's installed and provides an environment for nitrogen that's already in the groundwater to be broken down before it reaches the water body, inlet widening, which looks at the inlet of a pond and whether it's feasible to increase that inlet and increase the tidal flushing in and out of that pond system to be able to flush nitrogen out of the pond. And then other technologies, such as the potential for dredging in some of the ponds, looking at how Phragmites that is already existing in the ponds may contribute to nitrogen uptake, and then aquaculture in some of the ponds. And that is being balanced with limited sewering to come up with a plan that meets the TMDLs. As part of the project, we looked at 3 different alternatives. The first, which is required to be documented by the state, is your no action alternative. So what happens if you keep going as you're going today? What's anticipated to happen is population will continue to grow, and there will be additional environmental impairments to the ponds, as well as the potential for lawsuits. So the TMDLs are a regulatory mechanism that are spawned by the Clean Water Act. So not fulfilling them is actually in violation of regulations. The second option looks at maximizing the amount of promising pilot technologies as part of this plan. So some of the non-sewering alternatives that I discussed in the previous slide, including permeable reactive barriers, shellfish, are pilot technologies. So data is being gathered to see how well they perform. And if they're successful, they can be incorporated into the plan. Another major pilot is a provisional, innovative, and alternative system that's being developed currently on the island, which has a very low nitrogen level. So again, if that's successful, and there are enough installations that are put in, enough data that's gathered to allow it to be considered a general use by the state, that can be used as part of the plan, and it'll result in a more cost-effective program. Mass DEP allows us to use these types of technologies in our plans as long as we have a backup. So if any or if all of the technologies don't perform as well as anticipated, that there's a backup, which is traditionally centralized treatment and sewering, or using the INA systems that are under general use. So Mass DEP has a list of what's made it through the piloting process, and then a list of what is currently making it through the piloting process, and if successful, would make it on that general use list. So our preferred alternative is that second option, which is looking to maximize the amount of pilot technology as possible. It includes inlet widening, dredging, permeable reactive barriers, the use of the provisionally approved INA systems, centralized collection and treatment, and the potential for intermunicipal agreements. So going through pond by pond, what's inside this dark blue line is the Lagoon Pond watershed, and in light blue are the properties inside the Lagoon Pond watershed that are within the town of Oak Bluffs. In order to meet the TMDL goals for the pond, we're looking at a combination of decentralized treatments. So that's either individual on-site INA systems or a cluster system. And a cluster system is a technology that's appropriate for, say, development, where multiple houses can tie into one bigger INA system. So it's an option that may be more cost-effective for some communities. And then balancing that with sewer extensions in the area to meet the TMDL goals. This is the Senjikataket Pond watershed. And for this watershed, we're looking primarily at decentralized treatment, so provisional INA systems and cluster systems. In the future, if there's as much growth as anticipated, there may be a need for sewer extensions also. But that's something that would be looked at, and the decision would be made whether to implement that sewer or not as growth occurs in the watershed. For farm ponds, as part of the Massachusetts Estuaries Project, there was modeling done on whether increasing the inlet in farm pond could provide enough flushing to flush out most of the nitrogen that's needed for nitrogen management. That was found to be successful. So the town is currently pursuing the design and construction of that inlet widening, which is anticipated to handle the majority of the nitrogen management needs for that pond. And then in the future, depending on the amount of development, there may be also a need for provisional INA systems and cluster systems. For Lake Kashmu, there's a very small portion of Oak Bluffs that drains into the Lake Kashmu watershed. So this is a good example of where the town can work with its neighbor, come up with an intermunicipal agreement, which would mean that, so Tisbury shares both Lake Kashmu and Lagoon Ponds with Oak Bluffs. So there may be the potential for an agreement say if Tisbury is willing to handle a little bit more of the nitrogen load in Lake Tashmo, and in return, Oak Bluffs would handle a little bit more of the shared load in Oak Bluffs, which would allow both communities to meet their TMDL goal in the most cost-effective manner. So that's a future option that the town could look at. And the last watershed is Oak Bluffs Harbor. This is the only pond system that still has a simulated capacity. So it hasn't become overloaded with nitrogen yet. But depending on how much population growth there is in the future, there may be the need to implement decentralized treatment systems, or potentially to have sewer extensions from the main treatment system, which is primarily in the business district at this point. And as part of this program, there's what's called an adaptive management plan. So it allows the town to evaluate how it's growing, how these technologies are working, and to adjust the plan on periodic basis. So it's not a plan that you develop once and it's set for 20 years and you just implement it. It is a living document that you're constantly assessing how these different mechanisms are working and adjusting as needed. So for the program that I outlined, we came up with a financial model that looks.
Can I just interrupt? Can I interrupt for a second? I want to ask a
Yes.
question. Those maps of the town are great. You don't have a map that shows the properties that are sewered, do you?
Not in this presentation, but I do have that. I can distribute it after the meeting.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Thank you.
Sure. And I meant to say at the beginning of this meeting that if anyone has questions, please feel free to jump in at any time, or we can wait till the end of the presentation, whichever is easier. So the financial model was developed for capital costs. So that doesn't include operations and maintenance. That's the cost to initially implement the programs. And they include construction, legal, fiscal, and engineering, and appropriate contingencies for the level of planning that we're looking at. And it's for the different components that we discussed in the 5 maps in the previous slides. So we made a number of assumptions on how this would be financed. These will all need to be refined. But for our initial estimate, we looked at a 30-year program. So the plan would be implemented over 30 years. And what the estimated annual costs would be for different types of properties. I mentioned that this is a 30-year program. These costs are inflated to the midpoint of construction. So they carry a significant amount of inflation in them. So if we look in today's dollars, they would be less. But because not everything is happening today, we wanted to carry that inflation factor to make it more realistic for future costs. So under this breakdown, the town share, which is covered by property taxes, on an average annual basis would be about 1.5 million. Properties that are currently connected to the sewer system would have an annual cost of about 570,000. Properties with new sewer connections would have a cost of about 1,900, and properties with INA systems, 1,420. When we developed this model, we used fairly conservative estimates on what kind of grant funding would be available as part of the program. And as we continue to explore grant funding opportunities, they can be worked into the financial model. So just one example that I wanted to give, Gail at the beginning of the presentation had mentioned the Cape and Islands Trust Loan Forgiveness Program. So this is a program that towns on Martha's Vineyard can vote to become a member of. And there's a rental tax that is collected, and it's used to help fund nutrient management projects such as the ones in this program. So if the town does go through that process and becomes a member of the trust, they're eligible for 25% principal forgiveness for nutrient-related capital projects. And so this is just an example of how with additional funding, these costs are anticipated to go down. And there are additional funding opportunities that we'll talk about in a few slides that could be incorporated into the model. But to start with, we wanted to take a fairly conservative approach. And for that cost model, this is a first step in the implementation schedule of how the program may be rolled out. So the very first project that needs to happen is for the wastewater treatment to be upgraded to replace the aging equipment and then also to provide the capacity for the program. I'm sorry, was that a question? Or am I just caught a little mic noise? So once there's capacity at the treatment plant, there would be multiple phases of sewering. At this point, we're anticipating that they would be staggered to help fit the sewering into the capital program for the town. We're anticipating that the Farm Pond inlet widening and Lagoon Pond permeable reactive barrier projects would happen early on in the program, and that there would be a program for the conversion of Title V systems in areas that are identified that need the conversion to convert over to INA systems. And the mechanism of how that would happen would be worked out with the town. So before we talk about what the overall capital cost is, I just wanted to take a moment to put in perspective for other communities on Cape Cod how much some of their programs are. And many of these are much larger towns than many of the towns in Oak Bluffs. But Barnstable just recently approved their program, which is over $1 billion. Falmouth is very proactively working on incorporating some of the pilot projects that we talked about. If you look at their contingency approach, that's estimated to be about $600 million. So they're working to make this a much lesser project, but on the other end of the bookend, it's estimated to be about that. And then projects that are towns that are much closer to the size of Oak Bluffs, which is about 5,000. Chatham is $350 million, Harwich $400 million. And again, I just wanted to provide this as an order of magnitude comparison. So this is the town of Oak Bluffs. Our estimate now is for a 30-year program. It's about $136 million, again, inflated to midpoint of construction. About 60% of that cost is for the centralized collection and treatment, so the expansion of the facility and the necessary sewering. 36% is for the INA program, so converting properties that need it from Title V systems to INA systems, and then smaller portions for the inlet widening and the permeable reactive barrier. And these costs, it's the total cost of the program. So there's no funding built in whatsoever. This is what it would cost to do the program. And then we start looking at how different funding opportunities can be worked in to bring down the overall cost of the project. So this slide just shows Oak Bluffs in comparison to the other projects. And each of these are very unique projects, so we don't want it to be a direct comparison, but just as an order of magnitude of how, what these costs look like.
Question, what does $136 million translate to in today's dollars?
I can send that after. Can't do the math quite that quickly, but I should be able to back calculate it pretty quickly after the meeting.
I have a question, please.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. So 6,000 people in Chatham, it would cost $350 million. And I'm wondering why it would be so much less with Oak Bluffs, 5,000 people costing $136 million. That's like a third of the cost of Chatham. And I wonder, why is that?
That is a great question. So there's two major factors for the cost difference. The first is when you look at the amount of nitrogen that needs to be taken out of the estuaries in Chatham, it's much higher than what needs to be taken out in Oak Bluffs. So they're handling a higher amount of nitrogen that they're trying to manage. The second is that Chatham decided for fiscal equity reasons to expand their sewer system beyond what is strictly needed just for TMDL compliance. So by the end of their plan, they will end up sewering their entire community, which is reflective in the price. And they felt that that was a more balanced approach for taxpayers,
Okay,
whereas Oak Bluffs is looking to maximize the non-traditional. That's a great question.
yes.
And that's what I was trying to allude to. Each one of these do have little nuances to them, so it's not a direct comparison. Yes, I see a hand up.
Yeah, this is Bill Veen. I'm a staff member on the commission. I was wondering your pie chart showing the 4 different types of approaches. Do you have that broken out by the number of, let's see, the number of dwellings or structures and the amount, I guess the relative amount of nitrogen being addressed or nitrogen remediation being addressed within each of those categories? I'm trying to get a sense of, how much, that 36% for the IA, how much more or less nitrogen is being mitigated compared to the other 3 measures or efforts?
That is another great question. I do have it broken out by number of building units. I would ask that I send this out after, just so I don't misquote it. And I can fairly easily do the calculation, dividing it by nitrogen load so that there's a comparison. So I can provide that information also.
All right.
But that's a great metric to use.
Deja, I have a chat question. Did the plan use specific build out projections, and how did you arrive at those numbers?
Yes, so the population projections were based on University of Massachusetts Donahue Institute does population projections for each of the communities in Massachusetts. So those were used looking out at a 20-year period. And then as part of the MEP reports, Martha's Vineyard Commission worked with the MEP project to develop a build-out analysis for each watershed, which indicates how much available growth capacity basically there is in each of the watersheds based on zoning. So we're not looking at build-out, but we looked at distributing that population proportionally based on how much growth capacity exists in each of the watersheds. And then we also worked with the,
Let me just chime in here. In conjunction with this, there will be like zoning, probably some type of regulation to control growth. I don't want to say limit, but control growth with the planning board or the Board of Health. So that way, some people that are going to be sewered will not be able to grow anymore than because they're sewered, for instance. And, part of this plan, when you give it to DEP, is there, you have, as Anastasia said, projections based on current zoning and current growth tables. And the plan is flexible. So we have to constantly do, obviously measuring the results in the ponds, and also, just the growth factors. It's something that is going to require study as it goes forward, if it goes forward, as it goes forward, as well as flexibility to make changes along the way should there be a need.
thank you, Gail. So One of the first projects that would be implemented is the upgrade of the existing facility. When we presented this project to the Capital Improvements Committee, there was a question on what was the breakdown of the cost estimate of approximately how much is needed. We talked about how a lot of the equipment at the facility is aging out. So how much would be needed to replace equipment in kind versus how much of the overall budget is going towards increasing the capacity of the wastewater treatment plant and providing a higher level of treatment at the plant. And so that's what this breakdown is. So about 2/3 of the cost are to replace the equipment in kind, and then the remaining third is for the upgrade of the facility to be able to handle the additional flow that's anticipated to be sent to the facility over the 20-year planning period.
Anastasia, can you explain in a nutshell the approach that the DEP is looking for those up island towns that don't have to, you know, where they don't have sewer? Just the approach of, you know, addressing the MEP reports and what they're looking for in a, you know, I call it a CWMP or a wastewater management plan in a nutshell.
Oh, of course.
Which is,
Yeah. So I would call it a nitrogen management plan, right? You're coming up with an approach of how are you going to manage the nitrogen to meet your goals, looking at how much nitrogen is currently being produced, how much nitrogen may be produced in the future, and how much can the ponds assimilate, which is documented in the MEP reports. And so what the state is looking for each of those TMDLs is for the town to formalize their approach of how they will reduce enough nitrogen to meet those TMDL goals. Does that answer your question, Gail?
Yeah, that's a good one in a nutshell. And how you're going to manage it ongoing. So in order to do that, you know, you sort of need to look at your zoning, the potential growth, the population growth, and it's really a numbers game. So it's simple, but it's also complicated. But I think all of the towns have to do it, you know, that are part of the MEP system. And I think that's all the island towns anyway.
Yeah. And so going through this process provides a systematic approach to do that analysis. It also has the benefit of setting each community up for a much more attractive financing through the state with an improved plan. So that gives towns access to 0% financing for nutrient management projects, which is another advantage of going through a formal approach for this. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier in the presentation, we looked at some fairly conservative approaches for what type of grant funding may be available as part of the plan. The town of Oak Bluffs has successfully qualified for USDA funding in the future, which can fund both design and construction projects. It's been identified that both the permeable reactive barrier and inlet widening will likely be grant funded. And the town or the state does offer a small amount of principal forgiveness through the Clean Water Trust for these types of projects. As we talked about, if the town does become a part of the Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund, that principal forgiveness percentage goes up substantially. So what's reflected here is about 4.5%, and then an additional 25% would be forgiven as being part of that fund. Other funding opportunities that may be available that we'll continue to look at, but that haven't been worked into the plan yet, include the federal infrastructure funding that we've all been hearing more about in the past few months, the potential for coastal zone management funding, the potential to transfer funds from Community Preservation Committee to help fund some of these projects, setting up a municipal water infrastructure investment fund, and potential funding sources for some of the non-sewering alternatives. So as those are identified, they could be worked into the financial plan. And the next topic is something that Gail hinted at a little while ago, and that's the idea that for this plan to work, nitrogen needs to be managed not only for today, but into the future to ensure that the plan is allowing the amount of nitrogen that's needed into each of the ponds. So as we discussed at the beginning of this presentation, one of the major factors that cause the degradation in the ponds is the growth that's happened in these coastal water bodies. So each community needs to think as it continues to grow, how that growth will be managed. Which leads to the implementation of nitrogen management strategies. So for Seward properties, for the type of funding that will be pursued, the state does require that a flow neutral management strategy is put in place. So that's either a regulation or a bylaw that outlines how the town anticipates to grow in the different impaired watersheds where the sewering is being put in. There's different ways to implement the management strategy. Many of the towns establish a maximum number of bedrooms by lot size, which is one way that it can be managed. But that would be established by the town as either a regulation or a bylaw. And then a similar approach should be considered for INA systems, potentially looking again at allowable number of bedrooms per lot size. And that's a strategy that would be developed as a Board of Health regulation with town input, which would allow the town to know how it's going to grow and how much nitrogen in the future would be contributed to each of the ponds to ensure that the goals are still being met. So the next step is in this process is to continue to have public presentations and public discussions as the draft recommended plan is developed and to incorporate that public input into the draft recommended plan. And then once that draft recommended plan is ready, to present it to the Board of Selectmen, who will vote on adopting the plan. Once that vote is successful, the plan would be submitted to the state for its review and approval. And then concurrently with that, one of the first steps that's needed in the plan is the upgrade of the wastewater treatment facility. So this is a project that will be going into final design very shortly. And the town may be looking to vote on a construction appropriation for that project as soon as this spring, in spring 2022 town meeting.
And what will be the cost of the upgrading of the current sewage treatment facility?
So it's approximately $26 million.
For just the upgrading, and it's 20 years old. And
Yes.
so we're looking at the next thing we're talking about for the next period, a 30-year loan for a new facility. That doesn't quite make sense, does it? In terms of why is it breaking down to the tune of, what was it, $45 million after just 20 years?
So it's not breaking down. Components that were only designed for 20 years are scheduled to be replaced at this point. There are many components of the plants, including the buildings themselves and the tanks themselves, which are very expensive components of the plan that have a 50 to 100-year life. So as part of this upgrade, we're only targeting equipment that, as anticipated, is at the end of its design life.
Well, that's my question, I guess. Why would something costing that much money have only a 20-year lifespan? It seems like that is a very inefficient machinery.
I'll just jump in here, for example, it's a design lifespan, and that's the way the market is. We have, grinder pumps that have I think they're maybe less than 20 years that are beginning to break down. The pump systems, the major pump systems, I think there are 3 or 4 of them around the town are beginning to break down.
Yeah,
And we've been replacing parts of them piecemeal, but there's nothing on the market that lasts, there are different components, but nothing on the market that lasts that long. And that's why sometimes, part of the reason you need these 20-year plans, because DEP requires you to have updates after 20 years is that reason, because a lot of the parts are known to have a certain lifespan. That's all. That's, I mean, that's.
Yep, I
Um,
hear you.
Yeah, and the other thing that I would say to that, just adding on, is 20 years is considered a reasonable amount of time to look out. And even 20 years, right? We're anticipating what's going to happen in the next 20 years. If you look even further than that, you're installing equipment that you're not going to be at that design capacity for much later than 20 years. So it makes sense to have that equipment for the, for the period you're looking at.
I mean, my personal opinion, and I think, you can see the numbers, is that sewer is one of the most expensive ways you can deal with this problem. And I keep telling that to people, because it's not only installation and the construction of the plant and the running of the plant, but it's also the replacement, because it always has to be replaced. And it's a very expensive solution. It's a sure solution, but expensive.
Is there a
Anastasia, I have one
comparable-
more question. Clean Water Trust, does the principal forgiveness mean that the revenue from the trust pays off the loan, or is it a separate revenue stream from the state and Fed?
It is, so it is collected through this, my like very big picture understanding is it's collected from the rental tax by the state, and it's set aside for projects that are part of the trust. So it is distributed through the SRF program, which is how the majority of these wastewater projects are funded in the state of Massachusetts, but it is only accessible for members of the trust. And the way that it's distributed is there's a percentage that's voted on, and every project that makes the SRF list that year gets the same percentage. So,
Yeah, but I think the way they dole out the money is on an annual basis. I think it pays for the bond, a portion of like 25% of the bond payment. So when you go out to bond for $20 million, it gives you a payment that may be up to 20% of that number. I think that's the way it works, Anastasia. We were talking about that. Not sure. They don't just give you a whole bunch of money in the beginning of your project. So if you have a project that's 25 million, it meets the criteria, they don't give you, whatever, 5 million or whatever it may be at once.
so it's over the life of the loan.
Yeah, over the life of the loan. There you go.
With respect to the question of costs addressed by Anastasia and Gail, I'm wondering, has the analogous costs, the comparable costs of IA systems, including the very new ones that are being developed on the island, been worked out over the 20-year period? I mean, how much more expensive is sewering? I mean, I acknowledge that up island it's not practical, but are those numbers known?
So earlier in this presentation, I had been asked to come up with a cost for nitrogen removal. And once I calculate those numbers, I think that'll be a really good metric to have that discussion from. And one thing that I just wanted to add to that, in the case of Oak Bluffs, based on the amount of nitrogen removal that's needed in some of the watersheds, we've looked at the calculations and they can't be handled with INAs alone. So there does need to be a sewering component. And what we're trying to do is to minimize that sewering component as much as possible.
Hello? Hello?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. So at this point, I think we have to look at something that has been proven for a long time, and that is that wood chips reduces nitrogen by more than 90%, and that such filter systems can be at every single septic system, and it would reduce it at 90% at a cost of $6,000, $8,000, let's say, certainly less than $10,000, way like 90% less cost than central sewering or the very, very expensive IA methods that are in place and getting more in place. So I want everybody to know that this is what's possible. And the restrictions for it is with the DEP. And we have to think together about how to, I want to put in one for my Title V septic system, which I'm ashamed to say that I came with a house that I bought. So this has to be, we have to think together about how to make it comfortable for our local boards of health to say, this is fine. The septic system stays, and you have this wood chip filter, which is entirely sanitary, and it costs 90% less. So this is, we have to find a way. I'm going to apply for this filter to be done, but it needs all of us to think of how to get it through so that the Board of Health would love it and say it's just a green adaptation to a Title V septic system. So that's what I wanted to say. Don't
So-
worry about the economics is what I'm saying.
One thing I wanted to add to that very quickly, the provisional INA system that we have been talking about, which is developed by John Smith, is based on that wood chip technology.
I know.
So that, yeah, that is the add-on system, and that's the costs that have been carried as part of this plan.
But it's terribly, terribly expensive way to do it. It's terribly invasive, terribly expensive. Fine, go ahead, but there are systems that are 90% less expensive than that, okay?
This is Adam Turner. Can I address that? There are regulatory provisions in this state.
I know.
The Board of Health just can't start
I'm
applying
talking about-
technologies.
I'm talking about a
Listen,
gate filter.
You say it's terribly expensive. It's $20,000. We're using a regulatory process that will go through the state, that will be totally legal, that'll come back, and we'll get to clean up these ponds. There is no shortcut.
Yes, there is. There's
Well,
going to
that's
be-
what
if there's a-
you say.
if there
That's
is-
what you say. I
The
disagree.
don't forget that the regulations, the Title V regulations are the things that are destroying our ponds. That is our government. That is the regulation that is absolutely against the law in Massachusetts and federal.
Well, anyways, we're doing it the right way. John Smith, that will be provisional, hopefully be public. It's $20,000, but I don't see any shortcuts to it.
I
Thank
know
you.
you don't know about it. You will. You
No,
will.
actually, I do know about it. Actually, I'm on several boards. I go to these things all the time. I'm on the EPA board for IAs. I'm doing it the right way. There isn't any shortcuts. And
I know
I don't
that
want you
you're
to
doing
keep
it.
telling people that there are shortcuts. There aren't.
You're doing it the government way.
Hey, Anna, come on, stop.
I'm in the
stop.
government.
Okay.
I am in the government. That's right.
know,
I
I
am doing
know.
it that way.
I know.
But you keep coming and talking about ways that are going to lead us nowhere. And I don't want you to get out of control in terms of saying that John Smith's system is what you just said. It's just not true.
It's expensive. Everybody would agree it's expensive. Anyway, we'll have next meeting, we can talk about this. This is what I would like to have on the agenda for the next meeting. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
That's enough.
Yeah, it's reality.
Hey, and I have one more question in my chat. How does the plan distinguish between old nitrogen that's already in the groundwater that is historic, and the future nitrogen based on the current use and future development?
So the old nitrogen is captured in the MEP report, and that is what is currently going into the ground. And then we have updated those numbers to 2020, right? So I would consider that currently produced nitrogen that is moving through plumes in the groundwater to the ponds. We then have a second metric for the end of the planning period, 2040. And as the town continues to grow, that's where the adaptive management program would be implemented to look, is that growth happening as projected? And then as part of the adaptive management program, there is also a monitoring component. So it looks at, is that nitrogen being generated as anticipated? Is that what's being seen in the ponds? As well as how well are the different strategies at taking out the amount of nitrogen that's projected. Does that answer the question? And there are, so based on the approximate flow of groundwater, you can do an estimate of how fast different plumes will flush out of the system. And there are, Falmouth actually has a really great program where they've installed a very extensive monitoring well network in one of their peninsulas, and they're looking at how well do those assumptions hold up to reality. So they just sewered one of their peninsulas, and they're tracking to see, are the estimates that have been used in these models, are they accurate, or do they need to be tweaked going forward? So there's a lot of active research to confirm the data that's being used.
And another complication to the plan, which we sort of briefly addressed, is that anytime you use an alternative or anytime you use an alternative or provisional system, of which Smith is one at the present time, you need to provide a backup for DEP to be satisfied and sign off, just in case it doesn't work the way it's supposed to. And then, as Anastasia said, ongoing testing, which we hope that the commission will help us out with. Ongoing testing and report to DEP to see if what you're doing is working, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, and that the numbers are stabilized and going down.
Can I just ask you a question about that backup system? So you have to install the new type of system, the IA system, and a regular Title V at the same time?
No, you provide like, we're going to take out this amount with provisional systems and alternatives like a PRB or, some other alternative system that requires, testing. I'm trying to think, Phragmite harvest, I'm just throwing that out, or oyster farming, alternatives. And if those don't work, your backup usually is a definite, which is sewer. So you say, listen, we're going to take out this amount with these alternatives. And if it doesn't work, we have sewer capacity to cover those lots with sewer. But you don't you don't do that until you have testing.
Okay.
In case it doesn't work. So if the Smith system doesn't come out with the numbers it's supposed to, and it's still provisional, you have that sewer backup or readjust your plan.
Anastasia, sorry, Richard, go ahead.
I was going to say, the new capacity of the system will be sort of on standby.
There's a lot of additional capacity for existing users. Some growth, yes. And I say standby, but it's not going to be sitting there doing nothing for 15 or 20 years. But
right.
It's to accommodate, reasonable growth too for those existing users, mostly in the concentrated downtown area.
Right. Hopefully the new systems will be, tested and everybody will be happy by then.
Right.
Anastasia, I've got a follow-up to some comments you made just about very basic things, which are how watersheds are delineated based on what sort of observations or measures. And secondly, what has been done with respect in sync with that to assessing groundwater flow rates, particularly in the parts of the vineyard that are terminal or lateral moraine as opposed to outwash plain.
Sure. So the majority of the watershed lines were originally delineated by USGS, the U.S. Department of Geological Survey. And then as part of the MEP project, all of these systems were modeled and those watershed delineations were refined slightly. And as part of that modeling effort, there was also a significant amount of field work that was done on Martha's Vineyard, stream gauges that looked at how much water is coming into all these coastal ponds, monitoring well networks, and that helped refine site-specific characteristics for the ponds. So there's a very general flow rate that we know for groundwater through these types of systems, and then that's refined as part of the MEP report.
Do you have any kind of calculation of error? I mean, not just a standard deviation, but I mean, given what you've described as just the general assessment about flow rates, do you have any any idea about what the possible range might be, given the variation in geomorphology and topography, and what the consequences of that would be? In other words, if the rates are much faster or much slower, and would that figure into anything that you're assessing?
I know the answer to that one. If I can say, in the moraine, it's very unpredictable. If it goes over a layer of clay, it goes very fast, which certainly has happened up in Aquina many times, showing sewage just flowing down from the toilets in the olden days. And sometimes it goes very slow because it goes through, in other words, it's unpredictable up there.
Anastasia, or I don't know if Adam is still on this call, or maybe Sherry, or does anyone actually know of actual science done, measurements done by a eco-hydrologist or anyone else, particularly in the areas of the lateral or terminal moraine, on these issues?
So
In the sand, it's roughly 1 to 2 feet per day in the most of the vineyard.
And that is absolutely correct. But the original data collection and assumptions were made by SMS. That is a question I would probably defer to Brian House. But I think to your second part of the question, the adaptive management program would be the verification of those, right? We have to start with a series of assumptions. And then as we continue down the program, to field verify them as these programs are implemented.
Right, so your adaptive management plan includes that as a variable that you would be keeping an eye on, the values of.
Yes, yeah.
Right.
And I will say that a very similar model was put into place for 89 estuaries in Massachusetts. There are some communities that are have started implementing their plans, right? So as that data is gathered, it'll continue to be refined. But also those models are continuously being refined. For instance, in Pleasant Bay, they just redid the MEP model based on some of the shifting of the coastal systems, right? So they are actively being continuously looked at. It's not a model that somebody set up in 2009 and we're still using it without thinking about how it's working with the environmental system.
Right, I would agree with that. It was never totally ground truth. It was modeled, and then they were using results that we see to sort of look at whether the model is functioning, and it is constantly being refined as we get more data. But there is no, it's not like groundwater or surface water where you have definitive stuff. It was always modeled, and I agree with Anastasia. It's constantly being changed, and the 3 bays and the other stuff on the Cape are good examples of that. When we did the PRB and we were modeling nitrogen and things, it didn't go exactly where we thought. It took us several different ground where we were actually getting samples to really establish a hypothesis of where it was going. So it's not a precise science yet. And I don't know if you agree with that, Anastasia, but that's sort of the way.
No, I do. And like every project, you have to start with a series of assumptions and then continue to refine them as you go along, which is the process that each of these communities is working towards.
I would like to say that these data were done long before computers with Bill Wilcox established years and years ago that we have a nitrogen time bomb happening from the septic systems, and it will take, it takes 1 to 2 feet per day flow rate towards the nearest ponds, and the nitrogen, all of it gets to the ponds, and that is what's polluting our ponds. And this was like what, 1970s, 80s? Bill Wilcox knows about this. And as I said, there was no modeling involved. It was actually measuring. I think they put dyes or something like that into the water. and got it, you know, where is it, how long does it take to appear as it goes downstream towards the ponds? 1 to 2 feet per day.
Mhm.
But that really is irrelevant anyway. It doesn't matter how long it takes. The fact is that the nitrogen eventually gets into the ponds and then kills the ponds.
Yeah. Yep, I agree with her.
Per Title V regulations, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that is reality. And wood chips can totally stop it.
Mhm.
That is reality.
Can I follow up? There was mention made of the other towns in the watershed contributing to the ponds that we're talking about. And I know, you know, Eggertown's got a sewer system and they're dealing with issues themselves, but West Tisbury, I know, has come up in this discussion before. Has there been any discussion with officials in West Tisbury about the possibility of them helping to fund this, since we're getting their wastewater?
We don't need any funding. We do not need any funding. We just need to do it.
Richard, the answer to that is, I think some time ago, at least from what I know, maybe that was been 3 years or so, a very informal conversation, and the answer was, we don't have any money, we can't do it.
You don't need any money.
I don't know. I just don't know what the plan is.
Next meeting, we'll talk about this.
Okay, are there any more questions?
Tons of questions, of course, tons of talk that we have to do about this. But, you know, if the time is up, we'll do it next time.
Thank you very much, Natasha. That was great.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
so much for this short notice and
Yeah,
the great presentation.
it was a
Yeah,
great presentation.
Great
That's a great-
presentation.
Great picture to end it with. So we still got some time. We usually quit about 2 o'clock, I guess. Does anybody have anything that they want to discuss with their own, you know, situations that they're concerned about?
I just want to report that the Cape and Islands Water Quality Task Force, they're allowed to charge 2.5% on Airbnbs for wastewater. They raised $72 million this year, which is sort of a drop in the bucket, but compared to what their needs are. But they raised significant amounts of money, which are going towards sewer systems and other kinds of stuff.
Are you
This is the
going
first. This is the first year that we've all.
to
We
that
also,
another meeting?
Hey, somebody should be muted. I'm muted. Am I muted right now?
you're not muted.
I'm not
I'll
muted.
mute myself, but I
No,
just
it's
wanted
not-
to report.
It's
on
not you, somebody else. Okay, go ahead.
That's really what the value of Anastasia's stuff is eventually, you know, we're going to have to fund these solutions to this kind of stuff, Anastasia. So you're doing great work, and there is money available. We also got, for the first time, IA systems are eligible for revolving fund money. Although you have to figure out some things, you know, in terms of how you're going to regulate IA systems and things. But that was significant too, because on the Vineyard, 80% of the homes are not serviced by sewer. So we're going to have to find several different solutions to clean up the ponds.
Yes, that's exactly right. And we need to be looking at the different options that are available to us, right?
Emma, I see your hand is up. Get your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. Adam, the funds that you just referred, the 7 million that were raised on the Cape from a 2.5 charge on short-term rentals, is that in addition to the taxes and fees that are already paid, or is that just
No, it's
reallocation?
No, it's addition. It's addition.
Okay.
It's addition. When the Cape and Islands were sued, which was about 10 years ago, they realized that, you know, the state realized that they were going to have to pay for a large portion of this And it was estimated at that time at over $1 billion, and they didn't have the money. So 2 or 3 years ago, Fernandez and Sear got a bill passed allowing for this Cape Trust to be set up to generate money so that they could respond to that lawsuit. That's really what that's really what it was to try to put some of the funds on short-term people,
Thanks. I
visitors.
just wanted to clarify that because to anticipate some of the pushback that we will get, because the pushback that we will get from folks who rent short-term, that pushback's real.
There may be,
No, I understand.
there may be, but I don't know. I think everybody's used to the 2.75 or whatever it is now. The additional 2.5, when they see how much these CWMPs or other comparable 208s are going to cost, we don't know what's going to happen. And I don't know if there was a lot of pushback on the Cape Towns, maybe initially. I just don't know, but it's something that they have a track record now. I mean, I was very apprehensive about it initially, but they're collecting more money than they ever thought that they would, obviously, because everybody's coming down the Cape and Islands. And so I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, but they're almost guaranteeing if you have, like a sewer plant or something sort of from scratch or a rebuild, they're guaranteeing up to 20 or 25% funding. Is that right, Adam? Something
Yeah,
like that.
they're guaranteeing minimums amounts, but again, as the technologies change, like Truro and some of the other towns are, going about it differently. They paid back Provincetown, I think, 14 or 15 million for the stuff that Provincetown had done. So it's, there's money, but you have to have a CWMP. You have to have some sort of a plan. They're not just going to give you money, but if you have a plan that says, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to combat the things you want, this is how we're going to clean up, that there is funding available to it. And that's why Anastasia's project is so important, because it opens up all those layers of funding. The infrastructure bill has a lot of money for Clean Water Act stuff too. So
What
I'm
I
very
understood
optimistic.
what I understood from Julian Sear is that some of the CARE Act money, or the millions and billions the state has gotten, has gone into the state revolving fund for forgivable loans. It used to be a majority is low cost. Now it's forgivable. Yeah.
You're right. A lot of them are loans because it's an enterprise fund and you pay them back. But a no interest loan, to a town is a good deal in a lot of cases, depending upon what the town wants to do and how much development it wants to open up. So, but that's a decision Oak Bluffs is going to have to make in other places. So,
Anybody else have anything they want to talk about? It's happened. I know it's a slow time for us being outside on the water, but spring's around the corner.
Well, let me ask. I know you're dying to get outside, but let me ask: are any of you interested in the things that I'm talking about? Is there any interest in something that would be much cheaper, much more reliable, infinitely much easier to fix if it ever breaks down, and using just local wood chips? I mean, is anybody interested in the concept, or am I just talking into what, Any responses to that?
Anna, I think that a lot of us are interested in that. My take on it is that it unfortunately doesn't quite fit into this conversation right here, because this conversation has to be about what is accepted by the regulations and abides by all of the rules. And there certainly is a contingency of us who are really interested in getting results and doing positive things, but they're not going to count towards the things that we have to do that are regulated. Does that make any sense? So I
No.
think there is a place for this conversation. It just isn't quite fit into
Okay,
this and with the CWMP
okay.
stuff.
So I would say, what I'm saying is leaving Title V septic systems like they are, just putting in a wood chip filter after the septic tank and before the leaching field. That's as simple as it is for every home. It can be totally tested. It's totally safe, sanitary. And the Board of Health would look at it and say, well, it's a Title V septic system. It just has this little extra tank with a pump chamber. If the pump ever fails, it just goes straight into the septic system. There's just nothing that can go wrong into it. And we'll just simply call it, there actually is a clause that says, essentially it says Title V or better. And so this is a betterment, an extremely simple, totally bypassable little box that goes after the septic tank before the leaching field and reduces the nitrogen by 90%. So this is what we need to think about together. How can this be phrased so that the Board of Health can just look at, I mean, I have the regulations and I'll show them at the next meeting. I'll put together a little thing for you so that you can see that it's actually completely legal. And it just needs that they use, well, here it says right here, Title V or better, essentially is what it says. And so that's what I want to show, because it just seems that nobody seems to have much of a desire to do what to me is obviously the right thing to do. So I want to have a chance to explain what it is I'm talking about, and then to see if, you know, I will say what I will describe what I will say, what I would say and show to the Board of Health, and they would agree that this is totally okay for them to say okay to.
Okay, well, let's say that for the next meeting. I have one more question. I'm hoping that this has been part of the study. Climate change is going to have impacts. I can think of two of them. One is sea level rise, and the other is the increase in temperature of the water. So has that
Right.
been part of the study?
Not
know
at
if
this
it's-
point. So it is something that towns are starting to consider. That model, the MEP model is, and there are actually models being done on the Cape. They're starting to look at how groundwater elevation will be affected by rising sea level to start incorporating those aspects. So I do realize it's a very important aspect that will need to be included in the project in the future. But that data is still being collected.
We just got a grant from NOAA to look at weather and climate over a 30-year period, Richard. We just signed it last week. Because especially on the Up Island ponds where they're shallow, rainfall and temperature mean a lot. I think certainly like in Farm Pond and other ponds and Oak Bluffs, it probably means a lot too in certain places. So it is a component. It is a part. It is a section that we need to look at.
And why do you think that what are you going to do about it? I mean, obviously the temperatures are going to go up. What are you going to do about it?
Is Ian still here? He had his hand
Yeah,
up.
he did.
Do you,
Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Jarvis, representing the Mass DEP. I just wanted to address what Anna was saying with regards to simply installing wood chips for treatment. If you can provide the results for that somehow, you know, have it tested, that would be great, because it would help to back up whatever you're saying. But from my knowledge, there is no way that you can just install wood chips and have them treat wastewater and reduce nitrogen by 90%. There are certain processes that need to be in place before you can get to the wood chips for them to do any treatment of nitrogen. So
You're right.
the
I've been
DEP is
doing it for
also,
40 years, okay? I've been doing it for,
Okay, let him finish, Anna, please.
the DEP is also, I don't think, trying to impede any processes for the improvement of nitrogen on the Cape or anywhere in Massachusetts. I think our goal is to assist communities in the best way possible to reduce contaminants that pose a threat to human health and the environment. So please, I would prefer, I would like that no one, think that the DEP is here as some kind of a roadblock. We hear these things, and that's not what we're here for. We are here to ensure that there are certain regulations that are put in place that once processes are presented, we evaluate them and ensure that they can protect human health and the environment to the best of their ability. So I don't think, please get that idea out of your mind that the DEP is there as some kind of a roadblock. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian.
please find out what the truth is, okay?
Okay, anybody else have any?
Sorry, Anna. And like I said, if you can present that
Yes.
information,
Yes.
I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not saying you're right. I'm just saying, I think we should work with data that can be used to represent what we are saying. We should not just be speaking, pulling things out of the air.
I have 2 books about it, okay? 2 books I've written.
Right, and that's what I'm saying. If you can present that, that will help, back your what you're saying.
Why don't you give them put your thoughts together and talk to them, either email them or put something in writing. But just, I think that's what you've got to do. Emma's hand is up.
I wanted to say something positive and shift gears just a tiny bit if we're going to start wrapping up. And I just want to let everybody know that the shellfish group is conditioning scallops, and we plan on spawning much earlier than usual. And so it's still time, but we are busy in the hatchery. And we are also hiring a full-time year-round position, which is posted in both the newspapers and is on the homepage of our website. And the application deadline for that is the first week of March. So tell your friends and colleagues.
That's great.
And can I add, I sent around an email last week for the climate action plan, the presentations that they've been giving, they're really good. They are also available online on the ICANN website. And I also put a link to all of the workshops that Great Pond Foundation had sponsored.
Yep, that's some great stuff out there. Okay, anybody else? I'm not seeing somebody's hand. All right, I think we're done. Let's go outside and go for a swim. No more ice skating for a while.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great month.
Thanks,
See you next
everybody.
month.
Thank you,
Everyone.
Jerry.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.